Okay, everyone. Hello, welcome for joining us today to talk about the CHIPS and Science Act and how to better align STEM education and workforce development to support regional innovation ecosystems. I'm your host, Catherine Knott. I'm a reporter with Inside Higher Ed, covering federal policy, which basically means I cover everything that happens in DC that affects colleges and universities. It's a lot, but as a part of that, I've been following the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act and the efforts on the Hill to make sure that Congress follows through on its promises with legislation. We have some wonderful panelists today to talk about this. With me, we have Iris Wagstaff. She's going to talk about the undergraduate education perspective today on this issue. You're currently a STEM program director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, managing a $30 million portfolio of NSF-funded initiatives focusing on broadening participation in the STEM research workforce and advancing innovation capacity at HBCUs. That's a lot. You managed to do all that? No sleep, exactly. Wonderful. Next, we have Matthew Linton. You're a senior manager for programs and publications at the Council of Graduate Schools, where you direct grant-funded programs and write guides for graduate education. He's currently working on national science-funded projects aimed at bringing more students into advanced degree programs to support technology areas highlighted in the CHIPS and Science Act and improve the data collection to address challenges the universities face in recruiting and retaining STEM graduate students. And you're back from maternity leave today, so welcome. Then we have Shaylin. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Oh, I will. Yep. And your senior advisor for education, labor, and future of work at New America. You lead the think tank's initiative on future of work and the innovation economy. He's also a Forbes contributor covering workforce and education innovation, and held a number of policy roles at the World Economic Forum, Association of Public Land Grant Universities, and the American Academy of Arts and Science. In terms of CHIPS today, he's particularly interested in opportunities and future trends related to community colleges in this area. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And then rounding out our wonderful panel is Adriana Bankston. I really should have rehearsed all these names ahead of time. It's great. Senior fellow at Science Policy for the Federation of American Scientists, where she's focused on building a robust STEM workforce and boosting federal investment in science research, among other things. She also helped author language on postdocs that made it into the final CHIPS legislation. So exciting. I want to author language one day. You'll share more about the role postdoc, the kind of the role of postdoctoral and early career researchers can play in STEM and some more of the big picture stuff. Anything else that I miss? Okay, before I stop talking, I just want to recap for everyone who's not familiar. The CHIPS and Science Act was signed into law in August 2022. It's a potentially transformative piece of legislation that was aimed at supercharging American research and development, means billions more dollars for higher education. The CHIPS part of the legislation put billions toward revitalizing domestic semiconductor manufacturing, while the science part authorized but didn't fund tens of billions in new money for federal science agencies. So big deal, but it's just rolling out in terms of implementation. So I've talked enough. Adriana, to kick us off, can you share more about why it's important that we don't forget about the and science part of the legislation, and have we realized the promises of this legislation yet?
Sure. So let me make sure this is working. Okay. Right. All right. So thanks for joining us today. As Catherine said, I was involved in authoring language for the CHIPS Act, so big fan. Of course, as we know, there's been a lot of discussion on the manufacturing and the chip side of the legislation. It's really important that we fund the end science, because that's what connects us to society and maintains our nation competitive in science technology through these provisions in the legislation that are, of course, it's a historic legislation. The bill promises $280 billion over 5 years to fund science, fundamental science, applied science through the TIP Directorate and infrastructure. And to an extent, I think some parts of the bill have been appropriated. Not all of them have, and I'm hoping we'll talk about that today, that we still need more money to be able to really realize the full promise of what this bill can do, because There's currently $6 billion shortage in NSF, which is 39% less than was authorized. So appropriation is still falling short of all the things we could do, but that being said, it's a massive bill, and as we'll talk about today, will help highlight regional innovation and diversity in STEM and other things that we want to see. So that's my initial comments.
Before we dive in, I have a question for Shaylin. Can you explain, what does STEM education have to do with the CHIPS and Science Act?
Sure, Catherine. Thanks for the question, and thanks for all of you for being here in person and online. You know, the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act enshrines some very important language around 10 technology focus areas that are to be the roadmap for technological innovation in the United States for the duration of CHIPS and beyond. Those 10 technology focus areas are guiding the implementation of the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act at the Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate at NSF. That's a big deal. This TIP directorate was the first directorate in over 30 years to be created at NSF, and the only one in legislation. So the fact that not only do we have this new directorate responsible for accelerating the translation of R&D investments into things that actually benefit people, jobs, economic opportunities, startups, technologies, we also have a roadmap for the technologies that are going to underpin that implementation process. In each of those 10 technology areas, there are important implications for STEM education and workforce development at the K through 12 level, at the community college level, the undergraduate level, the graduate level, and the postdoctoral level too. And beyond, I should say, in terms of upskilling the incumbent workforce and supporting their participation in the innovation economy. So there's been a lot of really needed and important attention on the CHIPS part of CHIPS, the semiconductor workforce development. Myself and many others were part of a workshop that the National Science Foundation hosted on how best to use the $200 million that they were given in CHIPS for semiconductor workforce development. But there is also a lot of money on the street today to support STEM workforce development in those emerging technology fields. Two specific examples, both in the TIP directorate. The NSF Excellent Program is a $30 million pot of funding to support partnerships between workforce development organizations and what NSF calls organizations with expertise in emerging technologies. But fundamentally, this is a pot of funding for work-based learning in emerging technology fields, internships, co-ops, apprenticeships, project-based learning. Another example is the NSF EPIC program that funds capacity building at HBCUs and community colleges to be able to support emerging technology workforce development, training for new jobs in autonomous vehicles and AI, even in very nascent industries like quantum. So the 10 technology focus areas are really where a lot of attention I hope will be placed in terms of prioritizing where we focus on the STEM workforce development implementation around the science part of CHIPS. So I'll pause there.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like none of this is possible if there aren't people around to do the jobs and to work in these fields. Okay, so we're just going to go down the line. For all of you, you know, this is a wide-ranging landmark piece of legislation. What would a fully implemented act like CHIPS and Science, implemented, fully funded, we're 10 years down the line, what would it mean for you all in your work? What are you hoping to see from it? What's the dream? Iris?
Wow. Big and important question. So full implementation for me will be the realization of participation from all of the US's human capital, particularly those who have been discouraged, underserved, underrepresented, minoritized groups who've been discouraged from the scientific franchise like myself. So full implementation would just be a broad diversity cadre of these emerging students who are prepared, trained, and ready to not only enter the STEM workforce, but to lead these efforts and initiatives. So not just being, a participant, but a leader, and actually framing this work for the next 10 years and really having, a sustainable, place at the table. That would be full implementation for me.
From the grad school side, the full implementation, I think that there's a couple parts to it that are important. I think one is, as somebody who manages a graduate recruitment pipeline program, it's the recognition that there's a lot of this work being done already, and that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Moving funding towards programs that are already existing is going to be one way of kind of keeping up to speed on this. The other thing from the grad level is there's this kind of saying out there that all graduate degrees are professional degrees. So when I talk to students and faculty, a lot of the concern around CHIPS and science is, are the jobs going to be there in the end? Particularly when we're looking at PhD students that may be in a program for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. There's real concern that they're going to be putting their time and effort to something that will have concrete job outcomes. So how can we make sure that we're bringing employers to the table as part of this and being as kind of concrete and transparent as possible with students about what their expected job outcomes can be, so that they can know that when they go in to pursue these graduate degrees?
I think for me, and this is reflective of the community college lens around CHIPS, but also more broadly, is this time has to be different. In the 20th century, on the backs of industrial policy, Silicon Valley came up, we had GPS, smartphones, we've all heard the impacts of federally funded R&D from the advocacy community in Washington. But there was an underbelly to that prominence and that American leadership and technology, and we continue to suffer the consequences of that oversight today, which is, as Iris mentioned, the innovation economy is not open to the broad set of Americans. By 2032, America is projected to be minority majority, according to some analysis by our colleagues at the Economic Policy Institute. We need to be more intentional about aligning technology and talent development for a more equitable leadership role for a broader set of Americans in the innovation economy. So I actually have kind of a little bit of a contrarian take. Business as usual is a recipe for disaster in the implementation of CHIPS. We have to think about how we support not just meeting the labor market demands around those 10 technology focus areas, but how we actually leverage this bipartisan re-embrace of 21st century industrial policy to leverage CHIPS to rebuild the American middle class. That would a successful CHIPS implementation look like for me, is if we move the needle on the rebuilding of the American middle class through these investments. And I believe community colleges are key to that.
Okay, so to bring this back to what's going on right now in Congress, I think in some ways, full implementation is probably unlikely of everything we want to see, because with Republicans in the House, actually, some recent articles show that it's not expected that all the workforce development provisions will be funded, as well as immigration reform. So hopefully we'll talk about this too when it comes to bringing talent from other countries. That said, I think, of course, with my lens, having worked closely with Hill staff and more interested in the grad ed and postdoc world, we contributed provisions related to professional development for postdocs, and actually postdocs were not in the legislation before we had this conversation with the House Science Committee. So I'm hoping to see that the funding that we lobbied for will be actually appropriated. And one thing that has been encouraging in this bill, and hope to see more, is that there are quite a bit of provisions related to training, which a lot of the bills that come from Congress focus on funding the research and the projects themselves, but not all the other things that trainees are going to need to succeed in science when it comes to mentoring and career development. And CHIPS, I think, was unique in that sense that they had a strong portion focused on this, and hopefully more bills will do that in the future.
Awesome. Thank you all. So Matt, what's holding us back from realizing all these ambitious goals? And anyone else wants to get in on it?
Well, I'm known as being the kind of doom and gloom person in my office, so it's only fitting that I also get the negative question to start off. So to explain a little bit about some of my concerns, I think I should do a little bit more background kind of on what I do and why that's important. So I manage one of the TIP-funded programs, which is expanding access to graduate education in the advanced STEM workforce. So what that is that's about $1.5 million of funding to upgrade and expand the National Name Exchange. So the National Name Exchange is a graduate pipeline program that's existed since the mid-1970s. It was founded at the University of Washington as a consortium of elite R1 institutions, kind of part of the kind of top-down liberal project of recognizing minority talent at American universities, and then sharing the names of those students who are interested in graduate education among that elite consortium. So it was about 45 to 50 R1 institutions. You had to apply for membership. There are membership fees every year in order to continue to join it. So that existed as part of the University of Washington until 2021, when the Council of Graduate Schools approached the University of Washington and said, we would like to take over management of this program in order to expand it out to institutions that are not necessarily R1 institutions. We recognize that, a lot of the institutions that were training and supporting underrepresented students in the United States were not the elite R1 institutions, and that in order to better improve the pipeline of those students into graduate education, we're going to need to work with a broader group of institutions. So I manage that program, and I have since 2021. And what the money is going to allow us to do is really going to expand and recruit more HBCUs, but also to really expand the purview of the National Name Exchange beyond racial and ethnic minority groups to broadly first-generation students. And this gets a little bit to my concern, which has been, as great as the CHIPS and Science Act has been for recognizing the kind of the missing millions, right, in science and education, we're getting contradictory information. I mean, so as part of the reason why we're moving to this access model of first-generation students is because the recent Supreme Court decisions have told universities that they should not be pursuing a diversity agenda on campus. And so we're getting a lot of concern from our member institutions, from our participating institutions, the National Name Exchange, that are saying, well, we're being told that we're not allowed to identify minority students on our campus. And so we've pivoted this program to being more access oriented and less diversity focused because we're hearing those concerns from institutions. So I really worry when we're thinking about making this a more equitable system, more equitable access to the middle class, that we're hearing contradictory information depending on what branch of government you talk to. Not to mention once you get into some of the states that have pursued very aggressive anti-DEI legislation. So that's the biggest concern that I have in terms of making this a reality that benefits all Americans and not just the kind of elite few.
No, I agree. And we know that there's some, historic underfunding, especially at the federal level for minority serving institutions, specifically HBCUs, which also have a number of challenges and barriers like infrastructure, not having an office of sponsored grants to help with grant proposal development. So just equity with regards to just awareness, and even those universities that are aware of funding opportunities, and even within CHIPS and Science Act, again, the lack of infrastructure and other challenges that are just systemic, that I think will require partnerships within the community between academia, industry, nonprofits, and government, even beyond this landmark legislation, which I think has laid the the groundwork. But again, I have those same concerns about low income students in addition to first generation students. And we know low income has been used as a proxy, is a proxy for minority students, but not necessarily, right? So I think supporting low income students would actually would be even a much broader and far reach, and especially for those institutions facing that pushback against explicit support for minority students. So I have some of those same challenges. I sit at the kind of 30,000 foot level at AAAS, but I manage a number of NSF funded grants that's focused on broadening participation at the higher educational level, and specifically dealing with the challenges in HBCUs. And even with the NSF regional engines, the 44 awards, only a couple of those, were represented by minority serving institutions, tribal colleges, and universities. So while there was some, broad representation, I think there's like huge opportunities to really expand access, as far as equitable distribution among these awards. We know that federal science agencies typically award R1, institutions. So I think there needs to be a paradigm shift of, what types of institutions, have intellectual merit, and even beyond intellectual merit, what types of institutions have potential to really move this landmark legislation forward. So really changing the way we view, review, and award these grants and funding opportunities.
And follow up, is that paradigm shift, is that kind of in the legislation, or is it maybe rethinking as we're going about implementing it?
I think with regards to what Shaylin mentioned with the standing up of the first new directorate at NSF within 30 years, that's definitely been a paradigm shift within the National Science Foundation, who since its inception has funded basic and fundamental research. And now with standing up the new directorate, there's definitely been a paradigm shift to actually fund efforts that are really being led by industry needs, right, and emerging technologies. So kind of flipping the script, right, to really respond to those industry needs and workforce needs, and really look at the talent available, right? So talent not only has to be identified, it has to be developed, but the perceptions of who has potential and where do we find talent? You really have to look at the non-traditional student, transfer students, immigrants, 2-year to 4-year college transfer students, and really broaden the lens of, what about students who have to work full-time or who have families? So really looking broadly at how to identify and also develop talent.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, New America conducted actually the first public interview when Erwin Ganchandani was inaugurated as the first head of the Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate at NSF. And in that interview, he called out community colleges as a pivot in NSF's strategy around STEM workforce development. And Erwin's team has walked the walk following that first conversation now more than a year ago, through the Excellent and EPIC program. But there's so much more work to be done. And, Matt's comments also, flagged for me where the rubber will hit the road on how these CHIPS investments could either lead to a closing of inequities and rebuilding of the American class, or the opposite effect, is actually through the regional innovation investments. So in CHIPS, there was the NSF Regional Innovation Engines program. That's the largest ever non-facility grant program at NSF in history, $160 million over a 10-year period. The awardees will be announced in this month or next month, but the finalists have already been identified, the 44. These engines are actually meant, and this was a driver in the legislation, These engines are meant to democratize access to the innovation economy, to these jobs that result from federal investments in R&D and emerging technologies. And they're focused on moving outside of the coastal areas where those types of activities have traditionally been concentrated, right? Silicon Valley, the Boston corridor, Seattle, San Diego. Well, it just so happens that many of these other regions have these restrictions around addressing racial equity explicitly. So the need to think about where to align technology and talent development is actually, I believe, through these innovation engines. And it's not just the engines. The Economic Development Administration was given $500 million out of a $10 billion appropriation to launch the regional technology and innovation hubs, the EDA tech hubs, they call them. The EDA tech hubs have a similar purpose, except unlike the NSF programs, they're more focused on the applications of existing technologies and R&D strengths in regions to job creation, startup creation, and economic development. In those programs too, there is an emphasis on democratizing access to these innovation economies. Well, if the awardees are located in these states that are hostile towards racial equity mitigation strategies, there's going to be some challenges in implementation. So one thing that has been really heartening for us to just monitor over the past 5 years or so, even before CHIPS, is just how NSF is starting to evolve, even in face of steep resistance. There are a lot of four-year institutions that think that by including community colleges and HBCUs, their pie is being eroded away. And their lobbyists will advocate for that. I'm an alum of one of those organizations. So I think that's why partnerships was in the name of that directorate, right? Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate. And since we are in this environment where, because of the Supreme Court decision and because of state actions or inactions, addressing equitable access to these jobs resulting from these investments it's going to require those partnerships with community colleges. The last thing I'll say on this front is we actually just published an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education titled "Community Colleges, Chips, and Our Innovation Economy," in which the NSF director himself gave me a quote affirming the importance of community colleges as the unlock to equitable implementation of the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank the NSF director for continuing to do this work in face of the challenges that have come about over the past few years. So I'll just add that.
All right. So coming back to when we start talking about this, what's holding us back? So I think funding is still an issue because we're potentially coming up with another government shutdown if the Congress doesn't move faster. So at this point, again, from reading some literature, it looks like currently Congress still hasn't negotiated on all the 12 annual spending bills. And the top lines aren't established entirely, so nothing will happen until that's done for 2024 funding. The other thing, but I did want to highlight, since we're talking about diversity and what the CHIPS Act has done well, to highlight a few programs that people may not know about. So Iris is probably familiar with the Includes program that also supports partnerships. The UpScore program, which is focused on smaller institutions, states that don't have traditionally a lot of federal funding. Senate has mandated that NSF give 20% of the budget to UpScore states. So that's started some debate in the community, which we were highlighted for on Science a few months ago. NSF also, or I should say the legislation, appointed a chief diversity officer at NSF. So that's to be determined to see if that'll happen. That would be exciting to support some underrepresented minorities and maybe increase the focus of NSF on this. The bill also directs OSTP to develop guidelines for agencies, including NSF, to conduct outreach to MSIs, which and other universities. So this, I think, is quite strong in the bill and can help to address some of the opportunity gaps.
So now that we've outlined all the challenges, if you have a magic wand for all of you today, and of course you would use your magic wand to address CHIPS implementation, what would you change about what would you change one thing, or how would you kind of fix some of these issues? Whoever wants to go first.
I can go first. I think for us, one of the real challenges that we would like help on is about bringing employers to the table as part of this. So, if we, as part of the National Name Exchange, had a list of 25 employers that were also partners of our program, that would be very attractive to students for enrolling. And it would get around some of the questions of kind of like, well, what's next? A lot of them end up looking at they see, we had 93 university partners last year, which is fantastic. And a lot of them are universities that students want to go to, but we still get a lot of questions of like, okay, I got into MIT, that's going to open up a lot of doors for me, but still kind of like, what's next after that? And so for us, having a tighter relationship with employers would be very helpful. I think the other part in terms of addressing the equity concern piece of it is that we know from working with institutions that are well connected with employers, they tend to hoard those relationships. So, if you're a very well connected institution, you're not necessarily going to share your connections with, a regional comprehensive university or HBCU. You're going to try to secure that connection for your students. And so having an organization like CGS, which operates on a national level, would allow us to facilitate those relationships with employers and universities that may not have as many of those partnerships, whether because of location or because of financial reasons or because of capacity. So bringing employers to the table would really be huge for us.
I think from the community college lens, there's also an imperative on employer engagement, but it's actually in the opposite direction. It's local engagement. About 98% of employers are actually small and medium-sized employers in America, less than 500 employees. So in our orbits, you get the Lockheeds and you get the DuPonts, the namesakes of this meeting, and those guys come because they have a lot of DC-based staff. But the lion's share of labor market needs resulting from these investments are going to happen at more downstream employers that maybe don't have a national presence. They don't come to DC. They're locally engaged. And that's why I think community colleges could really be helpful, because while a lot of attention is often placed on transfer pathways in terms of the community college role, the key value proposition of community colleges is actually their agility to work with local employers and embed themselves in local economies through their non-credit offerings, through the administration of apprenticeship programs, through offering, even there are 25 states that permit their community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees, community college baccalaureates. And the reason why those baccalaureates have come about, four-year degrees offered by community colleges, is because community colleges are more agile, more responsive to employer needs, and more workforce-oriented than their four-year counterparts in the region. MiraCosta College launched the first biotechnology biomanufacturing CCB, community college baccalaureate. There are now 2 community college baccalaureates in AI at Miami-Dade College and Houston Community College. So it's happening. Community colleges are responding to employer labor market needs, but it's happening locally, and there needs to be more funding to support that local partnerships between community colleges and employers. I think Excellent was a great start. It's $30 million. That sounds small, but it's actually pretty targeted investment. One challenge that we've observed with the initial awardees of Excellence, however, is the definition around workforce development is too broad. It's a university definition. Oh, undergraduate research, that's workforce development. Service learning, that's workforce development. Workforce development is bringing the learner as close as possible to the employer who has the hiring need and focusing on skill attainment relating to those employer hiring needs. And if we can make those programs and the dollars that are already on the streets, we need more, definitely, but we already have dollars on the streets targeted to meeting these more acute workforce needs at community colleges through these employer partnerships, that would be key. And shout out to a lot of organizations that have been helping to strengthen community college employer partnerships. Strata Education Network's report on this subject, as well as the Aspen Institute's report on this subject. There's a movement to shore up community college employer relationships locally, but there needs to be more of a focus from the dollars that exist today and the dollars that we hope will exist tomorrow.
Yeah, I followed that up to bring this back to the regional innovation that we're here to talk about. And I think, having worked, with the University of California and knowing that a lot of the dollars go to certain states in the country, this is, I think, my magic wand would be that somewhat the funding that, the NSF director talks about that needs to be spread across the country and to non-R1s, R2s and HBCUs and MSIs that really happens. So that's what I'm hoping to see. I think to Shaylin's point, the state level success, I think some of this implementation is already happening and maybe not as much publicized as it should be. So would be good to see more media engagement on what's working already, and I'm sure they're tracking some of that, but somewhere where we can see what's working and recapitulate that. I think legislatively, so to the second part of this question about what's the solution, I think Congress, as I said a couple of questions ago, that I think legislation is starting to change a little bit when it comes to supporting science, from just the research dollars to the training that needs to happen. And science bills that have supported diversity haven't always included the training component. So if I were in Congress right now, I would think about writing bills that include more training for grads and postdocs. We'll have to see a postdoc bill one day, maybe. The training is also part of what Congress is doing, and a stronger focus on that.
So I have a few areas, a few areas of the magic wand. First, from the with respect to regional innovation, from the congressional perspective, funding what's been authorized, right? So the realization, the realization of that funding. As Shaylin mentioned, there's a lot of money out there on the streets now, but just again, who gets these awards, who gets these funding, like just really intentionality about reviewing the entire process, right? From just the design of these grant and these grant opportunities to better provide access, right? Again, democratizing, access to these opportunities. I review for a number of NSF programs, and the same types of institutions always get awarded, again, with NIH and other federal agencies. So I think just from a federal agency perspective, just revamping the whole award process, right? So I know the NSF has done a lot with respect to reviewer training, implicit bias, and that's great. But I think of complete overhaul of how these awards are designed. If you really want to target specific underrepresented communities, more EPSCoR regions, the regions that don't have the R1s and that don't get the federal funding. I think partnerships are key, much like Shaylin mentioned with community colleges. HBCUs historically take the students who are least prepared, who are low income, who are first generation, who check all the boxes, right? And produce the highest number of STEM graduates with bachelor's degrees for African Americans specifically. So HBCUs have been doing this for decades, right? And I think there's a lot that, predominantly white institutions can learn from how HBCUs take the least prepared and transform them, into talent. And I think those partnerships are key, because we can't rely on Congress. We can't rely on, federal agency funding. I come from the chemical industry, Dow Chemical. So I think those partnerships will be key to not only scale, but sustain these efforts that have been started. So I think all of those areas are needed.
Wonderful. So one of the things it all sounds like we're talking about too, with aligning STEM education and workforce development, is that higher education and employers have to work together, like most of you mentioned. Is there is it a chicken and egg problem though? Like, will employers come to the table? Will higher ed come to the table first? Like, what is holding back that partnership, and how can we kind of jumpstart those partnerships more and mitigate the risk for both involved, so that everyone just comes to the table and does what they need to do? Shaylin, you want to kick us off?
This is the $1 million question. I think one of the reasons why those organizations I mentioned, Strata and Aspen Institute, and there are tons of others, have been really focusing on this community college employer partnership piece, is because there's a lot of work to be done in strengthening those partnerships. So Stan Litto, who's a trustee at SUNY and a famous alum from IBM, wrote this op-ed in Barron's that actually advocated for CHIPS as an ideal way to invest in STEM workforce development, because mainly the CHIPS, actually almost exclusively the CHIPS part of this CHIPS and Science Act, workforce funding was through employer incentives. It's meant to flow through the employers and to the partners of the employers rather than vice versa. I think there's some merits to that concept, this idea of putting employers in charge of their own workforce development needs. There are some concerns about that, though. When it comes to addressing these equity issues, there are just not enough concrete carrots and sticks for the private sector to be held accountable and following through the way they are in the public higher education sector and public, community college and university sector. I think one unlock for STEM workforce development and partnerships with employers in higher ed are apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are the gold standard for workforce development, because it's the closest possible coupling between the learning experience and the employer who is going to hire the student, the apprentice. They're paid throughout the experience rather than incurring debt. You have your time compensated. It's not an either or when it comes to degree attainment. That's a misconception. We and many others have really tried to push the needle on degree-connected apprenticeships, in which you earn your degree while completing your apprenticeship program. There are examples of four-year institutions, University of Louisville, University of Cincinnati, Florida International University, to name a few, that have piloted apprenticeship programs at the research university level. And there are tons of examples of community colleges as apprenticeship intermediaries. Bates Technical College in Washington State. We just hosted an event at Trident Tech College in which we convened about 200 community colleges that are interested in being apprenticeship intermediaries. And the great thing about apprenticeship programs is there's co-investment from the employers. They have skin in the game. They have some responsibility to support their workforce needs. So I would love to see more attention around how the CHIPS funding could unlock apprenticeship scale in America, the way the Fraunhofers have in Germany and other countries have around the world. Apart from apprenticeships, one flag on this is sometimes, I worry that there's a little bit of an assumption that employers know what they need and know what they want. There's actually been studies done that have suggested that employers actually write pretty poor job descriptions that are not skills-based. And, this notion that there's work that needs to be done on helping employers help themselves. And the mechanism for that is, skills-based hiring. And, Grads of Life is one organization that creates resources to help employers move their job descriptions to be a little bit more skills oriented rather than credentials oriented. There's a whole movement in the HR technology space like Workday and ADP, so that the actual applicant tracker systems that these big companies and small companies use can recognize skills more so than traditional proxies for skills like years of experience and degrees, pedigree of degrees and credentials. So I don't see a clear way for CHIPS to support that evolution, but it's something that I think we can think about and follow on legislative moves. So
to take this in a little bit on the other side, because I spend most of my life in the university space. So, what can universities do to help? Because I think there's some questions about what is the role of the university in these partnerships, and whether it's, we're training students to do research, but this gap of training them to be successful in the jobs that they're going to have afterwards, it's still an issue. But when we think about higher education, when it comes to the grad and postdoc level and faculty and innovations that are coming out of the institutions, one thing I would say, considering how we can commercialize some of the faculty research and create companies and ways that these inventions can get out into the world. I think it's also worthwhile considering internships that industry can provide for researchers who are, or even students who are looking for jobs afterwards or opportunities. They want to use their research in society, and employers can create more internships for them. I did want to highlight one specific program from NSF that's more focused on this area, the Accelerating Research Translation Program. So it's currently the solicitation is open, I believe, but it's up to 10 awards, 6 million per award for 4 years, and it's focused on building capacity and infrastructure for translational research, regional innovation within higher ed institutions, and particularly seeks to train grads and postdocs in translational research to be able to support them in a number of career options, including infrastructure, and focused more on applied research than fundamental research. It's funded across directorate, across different directorates of NSF, sorry. And so this is, I think, a shift, signifies one of the shifts that we're in towards more translational research now from the NSF too, but good program.
So I think there's a couple things going on in the grad space that I think are important to think about. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is actually institutionalization of relationships between employers and in universities. Most of these in the grad space are happening at the personal level. It's faculty who know somebody who's working in industry, and they start off with that personal relationship and then grow it out in the university. The problem then becomes faculty move on to a different place, that breaks down. Or maybe the employer friend moves on to a different job, the partnership breaks down. So making it so that those types of employer partnerships can transcend personal relationships. And I've got a report that's going to be out maybe next week, maybe the week after, on post-baccalaureate micro-credentialing and the master's degree. And there's a few case studies in there of some institutions that are doing some innovative work in that space. The University of North Texas, in particular, has been very entrepreneurial in seeking out large employers in data science and trying to address their data science needs. And what they've done is they've institutionalized the program in the graduate school with the graduate dean instead of having it live in the data science programs with faculty. And it's mostly to get around that problem of faculty movement. So that's one thing. The other thing that's happening, getting back to the purpose of the graduate school, is it the graduate school's purpose to have employer relationships? And one space that we've seen some interesting competition within the university is between the graduate schools and continuing education around whose roles and responsibilities these partnerships are. This is a, bread and butter concern for continuing education programs. They're really afraid that graduate education is going to move in on their turf and take away a lot of their funding support that they get from employers. At the same time, graduate education is realizing they have to become more employer focused and they have to be more responsive to employer needs. So they're really seeking out these relationships. And so there are quite a few campuses where that relationship is frosty. I think it will get sorted out as we move along and we get more support in this realm. But right now, there is a little bit of a turf war on some campuses. In some places, the relationship's great, but on some campuses, about whose responsibility it is to facilitate partnerships between the universities and employers at the post-baccalaureate level.
Yeah, I just mentioned with respect to STEM education, one area that I see that is not completely missing, but an area for opportunity is just faculty professional development and training, especially STEM faculty. So we know from the research at the K-12 level that many K-12 STEM teachers start their profession lacking specific training that they need to teach STEM subjects, the best way that they can. We also know at the STEM faculty level, most STEM faculty or significant number are experts in their field, but they lack best practices in pedagogy, especially with respect to teaching students from diverse backgrounds. So I think opportunities, if we really want these students to have the skills needed for these emerging tech areas, there has to be some attention and focus on the faculty that's supposed to be teaching these students and training them and making sure that they're equipped. Again, we know for students like myself, I was the only African-American in my chemistry department, and there were a lot of issues of, microaggressions and just bias. And, these STEM faculty are definitely gatekeepers. So, not just training and professional development related to preparing these students for these emerging tech areas, but also dealing, with the DEI issues if you really want to attract and prepare and retain students like myself.
I think Iris raised an amazing point. And to give credit where credit's due, there have been some great examples of employers investing in faculty development for emerging tech fields. So Amazon launched an AI educator enablement program, which is actually a paid professional development opportunity for faculty at community colleges and HBCUs to learn AI so they can teach AI. So it's an AI workforce capacity building program. And then Intel has actually partnered to create one AI offering at a community college in all 50 states by the end of this year. And they've been successful. There are now in America non-credit and credit-bearing certificate programs in AI at community colleges, associate degree programs in AI, community college baccalaureates in AI, apprenticeships in AI, and K-12 immersives in AI at the community college level, thanks to this Intel partnership. So we need more of that, a lot more in lots of different areas. But Iris's comments made me it's really important. I mean, if we don't have faculty who know the cutting edge that these 10 technology focus areas and CHIPS want us to propel towards, we're not going to be able to deliver on the training that employers are asking us to deliver on. So it's great to see their skin in the game.
Wonderful. Okay. We got about 15 minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience or our remote audience on Zoom?
This is really interesting, and I'm thrilled to see the investment. But I had I was not hearing something, and that is, what about technician training, which we classically maybe have put in vocational, craftsman, machinist, which is now a very sophisticated profession. When I was in the Navy, I found myself kind of pressed into some workforce development. And one of the things we did was look at all our technicians and say, which ones would make great engineers? which is like most of them. And we bootstrapped them through community college and BS, in some cases, even graduate degrees. But I think that we realized over time we had a tremendous problem with bringing people into our shops and labs as technicians too. It wasn't just the engineering pipeline. So could you comment some on, is there anything going on with this CHIPS that can help there?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the key roles of the community colleges in the implementation of CHIPS, is to meet the skilled technical workforce needs in the semiconductor space, certainly, but also in the other emerging tech areas. So, there is currently funding to support community colleges in that way through NSF EPIC and NSF Excellent, but there's a need for substantially more. One thing that's been NSF this has also been part of their evolution. I believe in 2019, NSF started formally accounting non-degreed STEM workforce as part of their formal definition for STEM. Is that right? I think that's right. 2019 as part of their STEM workforce. That's a great evolution. It's maybe 20 years late, but that's academia. So yeah, I mean, the role of community colleges in the implementation of CHIPS is to sort of support the technician and the skilled technical workforce needs as much as it is to expand pathways, transfers to four-year institutions, and degree completion ultimately. Yeah, I think high schools actually, that's also an area where community colleges can help, because one thing that New America is really focused on is youth apprenticeships. How can we scale apprenticeship programs in high school in which we take the best of dual enrollment, which is typically with a community college partner anyway, and an apprenticeship program? So we have our Partnership for Advancing Youth Apprenticeships that meant to help cities and states and school districts actually expand these youth apprenticeship programs. And we are seeing examples of youth apprenticeships in emerging tech areas like EVs in California, for example, or in biomanufacturing in North Carolina, where there's a big focus with NC State and some other four-year institutions. So I don't know about K through 12 specific provisions in CHIPS, but that's the community college role.
Yeah, I come from a K-12 STEM education research background, and I think K-12 is critical, right? Because I mean, especially at the middle school level, because if you're not already taking algebra by 8th grade, you're already not on the path for us to even be prepared for STEM courses in high school, right? And then we need these students to be, in the pipeline or pathway to even get to college, right? So I think K-12. That area is critical. One of the programs, again, another NSF program, is the research experiences for K-12 teachers. I serve as a reviewer for ITES and ASIL that focus on informal and formal science experiences. So I think that is one area that is really going to help, better support and prepare K-12 teachers with respect to teaching these emerging areas. But I think the K-12 opportunities definitely need to be expanded. Huge opportunities to really expand the K-12 support. And I just wanted to piggyback off of something that Shaylin said with respect to community colleges. I taught chemistry in North Carolina for nursing majors. So I'm a huge proponent of community colleges, and I think they are a great model because they're already aligned with workforce needs at the local area, at the local level. So I think they are a great model and framework to use for four-year universities. And I think with this legislation specifically, it opens the doors to a myriad of ways and mechanisms for students to gain competencies and training and skills that aren't necessarily a four-year degree. So maybe a certificate or some type of credentialing. So I think that this will open the door to many more opportunities for students to really be credentialed in an area without a four-year degree.
One thing, it's a little bit off the beaten path, and it's not CHIPS related. But as I was doing this this project looking at micro-credentialing and post-baccalaureate education, there's been an explosion of new policies and recognition for prior learning. And most of what's driving that is actually enrollment trends more than CHIPS funding. There's real concern about not having enough people enrolled in your programs right now. And so recognition for prior learning is one way of getting some of those folks that may have missed a step along the way into a program. And actually, employer partnerships are a great way of kind of pushing universities down that path, because a lot of times they will have folks that maybe, worked in a career and have all the skills, have all the competencies, but don't have the credential to show it. And so this is putting pressure on universities to say, okay, how can we create portfolios and other sorts of tools to allow those folks to show what they've learned without having to go through all the steps of getting the degree? There's of course concerns there. I mean, one of the big worries is that if you don't have it matching up in a program correctly, that you can have a lot of non-completers, folks that are coming in at the wrong stage of a program and can't quite do the work, and that leads to them dropping out. But there has been this real explosion of interest in graduate education and recognition for prior learning as a way of getting more folks involved.
Sounds like we have one more question.
It kind of already started down the path with, as you guys were talking, the pipeline of, so CHIPS and Science helps set up these different programs to democratize different things. There's these innovation engines. There's a lot of funding going in to try to bolster at grad up to post-grad level. So I was kind of thinking as you guys were talking, and you guys kind of started in this last conversation of like, okay, it does start in K through 12 though. And that's where I guess I was seeing concern, and you were just bringing it up there too, is like, that's all at the state or even down to municipal level. Federal doesn't get involved as much. Do you see it being an issue? All these programs are starting up. Will we have the people to fill it, especially in some of these regional levels? And if employers or universities are doing the work to try to get at least some from community colleges or other things regional, but if you're in the top 10% of your class in Arkansas, why would you? I feel like a lot of them wouldn't stay, right? They'd only go to the big research or coastal or other things or Silicon Valley. So it feels like it feels like we're starting at this top, or a lot of funding's going in, but the pipeline up, is it enough? And you kind of see it too. This is a whole separate thing, but you see with software or other things, they vacuum up all the visas because we're not doing enough with domestic as it is. So I don't know, I guess it's kind of a very open-ended question, but when all these cool programs are getting started and all this money is going in, how can we, I guess we're relying on the states to bolster their K through 12 and kind of match what these new programs are doing in their states. So
I can try to take a stab. Yeah, I mean, the K through 12 perspective is just really critical. I should probably acknowledge when the panel was coming together, you all may have seen in the program, but we focus on post-secondary here. So, community college, undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral training was really the lens. So we don't actually have except Iris.
I can speak to that. So I serve on the advisory committee that's updating the National Science Framework and Standards. That we started that work last year, and I actually wrote the equity section that is going to be a new part of the science framework for the next 10 years. So we are grappling with those issues, right? So what is it that students need to learn, but what is it that teachers need to know how to teach, right, these students? So, and there's a huge focus on engineering and technology while we're updating these science framework and these standards, but the majority of the country, except for 2 states, are on board, with the general framework of those science standards. But I think it definitely starts with K-12. So there has to be more integration, intentionality, and partnership with even getting these students into the pipeline, right? To even be prepared to pursue STEM degrees and even getting into college, right, and STEM majors. So we are working on those as we are rewriting updating the science framework, but it's a big key part of that is technology and innovation in engineering. So, yeah.
We have a couple of questions online whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds good, Anna.
I won't need
Let's just send the remote questions and then guys can continue this conversation afterwards. What are the remote questions, Anna?
Okay. Robert Buchanan asks, how do you overcome the compartmentalization of knowledge and the vast lack of understanding of the vast majority of the population?
That's a very big question.
I know.
I mean, this is again not related to chips and science, but I mean, interdisciplinary programs have been the driving force of that. And I mean, what we've done for a national name exchange, as well as some of the other Council of Graduate School programs, is try to make sure that interdisciplinary subjects receive their due diligence and they receive the attention that they deserve. It can be a little bit tricky, but yeah, interdisciplinarity is kind of the way to go there.
I'll tie my response back with the K through 12 question. I mean, I will say the states that have been recognized as sort of the leaders in CHIPS response, Arizona, New York, Texas, have been investing at the state level in the K through 12, and especially the sort of political justification. And it's, I mean, in our community, it's really sorry to even hear the word justification, but it's politics. The justification that we've heard used is COVID melt. So those investments have come through a lot of COVID melt mitigation bills in those states. So the hope is that we would be able to help through CHIPS, incentivize states to shore up their role in the CHIPS implementation, including the K through 12 investment. I actually also see community college, though, as being helpful in closing sort of the broad education attainment gaps that our online colleague asked about, as well as the K through 12 piece. Youth apprenticeships are like one example, but it's not the only example. Matt mentioned micro-credentials. There are lots of examples of community colleges through their adult ed programs and VOTEC programs partnering with K through 12 districts to offer industry recognized credentials. So these are credentials awarded by third-party certification bodies that are built on employer competency standards as opposed to faculty views, in addition to faculty views, I should say. And, you know, having a student in high school graduate with their diploma and an industry certification can increase their employability outcomes, even if they choose not to go to community college or university. So that's an interesting model that we've seen in addition to apprenticeships, but there's no easy way to say it. There needs to be a reinvestment in K through 12 education to respond to COVID melt, but also to just meet the economic opportunity needs that we're going to have for the foreseeable future. It's not enough. So I'd add that.
Cool. Any other questions, Anna? If that's it for the remote team, I think we've reached our time. Thank you all so much for joining us and for the conversation. And oh, yes, Anna?
Do you want the question? Not anymore.
Oh, yeah, if you got one more.
Oh, sorry, I was in mute. Okay, this is from Andy Williams. The greatest innovations of the future might lie in the margins that we currently ignore. How do we change STEM education to allow students to navigate ideas that arise from AI or that arise from the interactions between existing ideas that we'd otherwise ignore where they are too numerous and complex for humans to understand without greater collective intelligence?
So this is something that I feel pretty passionate about, I think, as somebody coming from a humanities background, which is that CHIPS and science and other big financial boons to education don't narrow the horizon so much that we lose sight of having a broad ecosystem of knowledge. You know, we've looked at internationally at Singapore and China recently as places that have really narrowed the kind of horizons of what education should be for their students. And we're beginning to see some concerns there where, you know, if the economy does move in a direction that we don't foresee, suddenly you have a huge glut of folks that are trained in something that is no longer directly relevant. And one thing that I'll throw in, my background is in history that I've mentioned. And I looked at university China studies programs as my dissertation. I was really curious about where did our knowledge of China come from. But one really interesting thing that came about was in the 1920s, there were a handful of scholars that kept saying, we need East Asian languages in the curriculum. We need Japanese, we need Chinese in the curriculum. That's going to be the future of economic development. That's going to be the future of the world. And university administrators and the government said, no, Japan is on the other side of the world. It's not relevant. The US is always going to be looking at Europe. And they kept saying that in the 1928, 29, 30, 31. Once you get to 1936 and it becomes clear that Japan is becoming potentially a political threat, there's an emergency of where are all the Japanese speakers? And I was like, well, you had a decade of folks saying that we need to make sure that we have a diverse group of talent in the pipeline so that we can meet threats or concerns or new ideas that we're not anticipating in the current moment.
I might maybe add to that, like, this is also the caveat around like overcorrecting to employer needs. Like if we go too much in that direction, we risk losing the forest from the tree. Like, yes, we need to equip folks with relevant skills so that they can find jobs that increase their standard of living. That's what, if you look at public opinion polling data, that's why people go to higher ed. That's why people go to higher ed. K through 12 graduates as well as adult learners. However, we can't risk losing the value proposition of a broad-based liberal arts education in the process. So yeah, for all the talk of employer partnerships and employers, there's also, you know, a double-edged sword that could come into play if we, as Matt said, you know, narrow a little bit too far in these specific employability skills and not the bigger curiosity-driven education.
Sounds good. And I think that is it. We have reached the end of our allotted time. Sorry if we didn't get to any of your questions. We had a great conversation though.